She hadn't spoken in months. Not one word. But when a battered German shepherd stood at her doorstep, the silence began to crack. What this dog uncovered, buried in snow, memory, and grief, would lead a broken family back to a place they thought was lost forever. Before you scroll, ask yourself, what if the one sent to protect you had never really left? Silver Glen, Colorado, mid-January, 4:23 p.m. Wind chill, 18 degrees Fahrenheit, snow flurries drifting from an overcast sky. The freight train thundered past the old signal post at the edge of Silver Glen's rail yard, its horn echoing between the rows of pine-covered hills. Ice clung to the edges of every rail and wire, and snowflakes pirouetted through the brittle air. On a sliver of packed snow beside the rusting crossing gate, a lone German shepherd stood perfectly upright on his hind legs. His posture was statuesque, balanced, with his ears pricked forward and eyes scanning each car that clattered past. To some, it would have seemed like a trick, to others, an eerie moment. But those who'd seen him before, locals who worked the rail line, or the baristas at the coffee shop nearby, knew it was no show. This dog was searching. He had been there nearly every day since the first snowfall of November. No tags, no collar. Yet everything in his bearing suggested training. Not just obedience, but duty. His fur was a dense coat of charcoal and russet, matted in places but well kept for a stray. His left ear had a slight notch, as if from a healed wound. Most haunting, however, were his eyes, amber, keen, unwavering. Some children called him Ghost. Others whispered he was the spirit of an old engineer come back to watch over the rails. But a name would come from a different source. Rachel Monroe sat in her old Jeep Liberty at the crossing, waiting for the train to pass. The vehicle, speckled with rust and age, exhaled white puffs from its exhaust into the cold air. In the back seat sat her daughter, Violet, bundled in a faded maroon coat with faux fur lining and mismatched mittens. The 8-year-old stared out the window, green eyes wide behind thick lashes, copper curls framing her face like the petals of a frozen rose. She was clutching a small sketchpad to her chest, legs swinging just slightly above the floor mat. Rachel, 36, had the look of someone who'd aged more in the past year than any mirror could admit. Her shoulder-length hair, naturally dark blonde, was tied back in a practical bun beneath a knitted cap. She had a wiry frame, just under average height, and carried herself with a sense of brisk utility. Her features were softened by sleeplessness and grief, but in moments like these, caught between stillness and motion, there was a strength to her gaze. A former art teacher turned baker after her husband's death, Rachel now ran the family bakery alone, juggling bills, sourdough schedules, and the long silences of a daughter who hadn't spoken since the fire. Violet hadn't said a word since the night their home burned. Not after the smoke cleared. Not after they moved into her grandmother's old cabin. Not even when her older brother, Caleb, tried to cheer her up with comic books or dad jokes. Specialists called it selective mutism induced by trauma. Rachel called it a heartbreak with no edges to hold. As the final car of the train rattled past, Rachel tapped the steering wheel absently, preparing to move on. But then, from the rearview mirror, she caught the shift in Violet's posture. Her daughter had pressed her mittened hand to the cold window, eyes fixated on the upright figure by the tracks. Rachel followed her gaze. The dog. The German shepherd was standing again. Watching each vehicle as if searching for a familiar face in the flow of windshields. Violet leaned forward slowly, breath fogging the glass. Her lips parted slightly. Rachel didn't expect it, didn't dare. But then she heard it. Dog. One word. Just one. Barely above a whisper. Rachel's chest locked. Her fingers froze on the steering wheel. She turned, not fully believing, and saw Violet's lips moving again. He's looking for someone. The moment landed like a bell's toll in the snow-hushed silence. Rachel blinked tears away before they could fall. Did you just, she began, but her voice caught. Violet turned toward her mother and nodded, small, precise. Behind them, the jeep idled. Beside the tracks, the German shepherd had returned to all fours, now walking calmly down the shoulder of the road toward the town square. Rachel didn't follow immediately. She gripped the steering wheel as if it were the only stable thing in the world, her pulse hammering. Violet had spoken. After 347 days. And not just spoken, but observed something. Felt something. Connected. Dog, she repeated under her breath. Looking for someone. Rachel placed her hand on her daughter's and whispered, "Let's go see him again tomorrow." Violet nodded again. And for the first time in over a year, Rachel saw something flicker across her daughter's face that she hadn't seen in ages, not just awareness, but curiosity. By the time they pulled into the gravel driveway of their home, an aging log cabin with patched gutters and a woodpile stacked like weary dominoes, Rachel's mind was spinning. The sky had dimmed into a slate gray. Smoke coiled from their chimney like a banner of survival. Caleb was likely inside already, hunched over his math homework and a peanut butter sandwich. Her 14-year-old son, tall for his age with shaggy brown hair and a serious brow, had taken on too much responsibility too early, becoming Violet's quiet protector since the fire. He didn't complain. He just adjusted. As Rachel unlocked the front door, she glanced back at Violet, who stood on the porch step, gazing silently toward the forested horizon behind them. That night, as Rachel tucked Violet into her bunk beneath her favorite faded quilt, she paused. "Sweetie," she whispered. "Do you want to draw that dog tomorrow? The one by the train?" Violet didn't answer. She just pulled her sketchpad closer. But Rachel wasn't disheartened. One word had opened a door. Tomorrow, perhaps another. Later, after the dishes were done and Caleb had disappeared into his room with earbuds in, Rachel sat at the kitchen table staring out the frosted window. Snow drifted like feathers across the back deck. Her eyes scanned the quiet woods, still somehow expecting to see the silhouette of the upright dog watching from the shadows. She didn't see him. But she felt something shifting. A pull in the air, as if the silence that had settled in their lives might finally be stirring again. Outside, deep in town, near the post office where the rails split toward the industrial line, the German shepherd had curled beneath a hollow beside a supply shed, his body tucked neatly into himself against the cold. His eyes stayed open. Every distant engine, every siren or whistle, lifted his ears. The wind carried memories, scents, commands he could no longer follow. But still, he waited. The girl had seen him. And he had seen something in her too. Something quiet. Something broken. But not beyond repair. The Winter Fair. Silver Glen, Colorado, late January, 10:07 a.m., 24 degrees Fahrenheit, overcast with a chance of light snow. The cold lingered like a breath on glass as Rachel Monroe stepped out of the bakery's rear door, her apron dusted with flour, and the scent of cinnamon and baked apples trailing behind her. The downtown square of Silver Glen buzzed with early preparations for the annual winter fair. Strings of white lights hung from poles like frozen cobwebs, and folding booths were being assembled by mittened hands and chattering volunteers. Rachel squinted against the pale morning light that filtered through the clouds as she carried a tray of sample muffins to the makeshift counter she'd been assigned. She was no stranger to stress. The past year had been an ongoing tightrope walk between grief and responsibility, but this fair felt like something more, a chance, however fragile, to rescue her bakery from closing. The Monroe family bakery, a small storefront wedged between a quilting supply shop and a used bookstore, had been in her late husband Daniel's family for 3 generations. Since his death, the foot traffic had slowed, debts crept higher, and Rachel found herself weighing the cost of butter like it were gold. Caleb Monroe, 14, with a mop of unkempt brown hair and a lanky build that hadn't caught up with his height yet, emerged from the passenger seat of their Jeep carrying a folding table. He wore his usual gray hoodie beneath an oversized navy parka, and his gloved hands handled the task with practiced care. There was a quiet steadiness about him that mirrored his father's patience. Caleb didn't speak much, not because of trauma like Violet, but because he thought before every word. It made what he said count more. "Over there, right?" he asked, gesturing with his chin. "Right beside the cider booth," Rachel replied, her voice muffled behind a scarf. "Thanks, kiddo." As she arranged the muffins, cranberry orange, pumpkin spice, and her signature brown butter apple, a familiar figure appeared carrying a roll of canvas tarp and a rubber mallet. Officer Jonah Hayes, in plain clothes today but unmistakably law enforcement, wore a dark flannel shirt under a black vest, faded jeans, and well-worn hiking boots. He was in his late 30s, tall with an athletic build, dark brown hair streaked faintly at the temples, and a 5 o'clock shadow that made him look like he hadn't slept much. Jonah had a dry sense of humor, a soft voice, and a tendency to stand with his arms crossed while thinking. Before joining the Silver Glen PD, he had served in the sheriff's department of a larger town downstate, but a personal loss, his sister's death to cancer, had brought him back to his hometown. He didn't talk much about it, but Rachel could read it in the careful way he asked about her kids, or in how he never minded silence. "Thought you could use a hand," Jonah said, setting the tarp down beside her booth. Rachel gave a small, grateful smile. "Only if you like manual labor and mild panic." "Both are specialties," he said, straight-faced. Then added, "Cider booth folks forgot their tent. It's chaos over there." As Jonah secured the tarp against the wind, Rachel glanced down the road where Violet stood holding Valor's leash. The German shepherd had a quiet strength to him, walking beside the girl with an almost human attentiveness. He no longer needed coaxing. Since that first encounter at the tracks, Valor had returned each morning to wait outside their porch as if reporting for duty. Rachel had posted a notice about the dog on the town board and the police station, but so far, no one had come forward. She knew, logically, that couldn't last. But for now, he was Violet's. Violet wore a padded purple coat and thick leggings tucked into snow boots, her copper curls bouncing as she walked. Her silence was different these days, not withdrawn, but thoughtful. When she stopped in front of the booth, she raised her sketchpad and showed Rachel a drawing of Valor watching over the fair. He was on his hind legs again, silhouetted against booths and snowflakes. "That's beautiful, Vi," Rachel said. She bent and kissed her daughter's temple. "You want to show it to Officer Hayes?" Violet hesitated, then turned the pad. Jonah knelt to her level, examining the drawing with a small nod of admiration. "That is one serious watchdog," he said. "You got talent, kid." Violet blushed slightly and tucked the pad behind her back. She didn't speak, but her eyes glinted with the beginning of trust. Caleb returned with a tray of butter cookies. He glanced at Jonah, then at his mom. "You need me at the booth, or can I try the cocoa stand?" Rachel raised an eyebrow. "By try, do you mean consume as much as humanly possible?" Caleb grinned. "Scientific research." "You're cleared," she said, waving him off. As the fair filled with townspeople wrapped in scarves and optimism, Rachel felt the old rhythm of community take hold. Friends stopped by to ask about the bakery, try the muffins, compliment Violet's artwork, or pet Valor. There were awkward moments, when someone brought up Daniel, or asked if she was dating again, but mostly, it felt like resurfacing from beneath ice. At one point, Jonah stood beside her as they both handed out samples. "You know," he said, his tone casual, "a lot of people are rooting for your bakery." "It's just muffins," Rachel replied. "It's more than that." Later that afternoon, while Violet and Valor curled together on a blanket beside the booth, Caleb returned with cheeks pink from the cold and a paper cup of cider. "I was thinking," he said between sips, "I could help more with the baking. Learn the dough stuff. Not just carry trays." Rachel blinked. "You sure?" "Yeah. I mean, it was Dad's thing too, right?" She nodded slowly. "It was. And yours now, if you want it." Caleb looked toward the horizon where the train tracks cut across the distant fields. Maybe Valor's not the only one finding his place. Rachel smiled and reached for his hand, grateful for warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. As the first flakes of afternoon snow began to fall, gentle as breath, the Monroe family stood beneath the canvas awning of their modest booth, surrounded by muffins, drawings, and something else harder to define, hope. Letters in the loft. Silver Glen, Colorado, late January, 7:42 p.m., 12 degrees Fahrenheit, wind chill dropping, skies clear. The air was brittle with cold as the last traces of sunlight vanished behind the pine-draped ridge west of town. The Monroe family cabin sat quiet under a frosted roof, wood smoke trailing from its stone chimney into a starlit sky. Inside, warmth pulsed from the cast-iron stove in the corner of the kitchen, where Rachel stirred a pot of potato soup and Caleb sorted old boxes from the loft above the garage. It was a chore he'd volunteered for after dinner, one that had waited too long, something about clearing out old Christmas lights and finding his dad's missing toolbox. Rachel moved with the instinctive rhythm of a woman who never truly stopped. Her wool sweater hung loosely on her frame, sleeves pushed to her elbows, a smudge of flour lingering on her cheek from earlier that afternoon. There was a tired but purposeful grace in her movements, and every so often she glanced toward the living room where Violet sat cross-legged on the floor, Valor's massive head resting gently in her lap. The two were nearly inseparable now, and Rachel was starting to accept, even depend on, the bond between her daughter and the mysterious dog. Caleb's voice came from the loft with a muffled, "Mom. You want me to toss this box marked Daniel, camp stuff, or keep it?" Rachel froze with the wooden spoon in hand. "Keep it. Bring it down." Caleb emerged, cheeks flushed from the cold air in the attic, carrying a weathered cardboard box sealed with ancient tape. The label was written in Daniel's looping cursive. He placed it carefully on the coffee table. Rachel approached, drying her hands, heart skipping. Inside, the contents were a time capsule, a faded canvas scout pouch, a rusting compass, a rolled sleeping bag, and beneath them, a small tin mailbox, the kind children used in school crafts. Caleb lifted it slowly, brow furrowed. "What's this?" Rachel leaned in, flipping the rusted latch. Inside were folded papers, yellowed and brittle, bundled with a rubber band long since hardened into dust. She untied them carefully. The handwriting on the top letter stopped her breath. "Hey Mike, thought you'd want to know." She sat, hands trembling, eyes skimming the contents. The letter was from Wyatt Keene. Over the next hour, Rachel and Caleb read through the bundle, letters exchanged between Daniel and Wyatt during their years in service, Wyatt as a young rookie cop and Daniel as a volunteer firefighter. They spoke of training mishaps, near misses, shared jokes, and eventually, valor. There was a letter dated 7 years earlier in which Wyatt described receiving a promising young pup from a specialized K9 breeding program. "He's sharp," it read. "Name's Valor. Reminds me of your old rescue dog. Big, smart, eyes like he already knows things." Rachel stared at the name and felt a pressure behind her ribs. "They knew each other," she whispered. "Wyatt and Daniel. This whole time, and I didn't realize." She looked toward Violet, who was quietly drawing in her sketchpad. Rachel walked over, knelt, and gently asked, "What are you working on, sweetheart?" Violet turned the pad. It was a pencil sketch, crisp and shaded, of Valor, again standing on his hind legs at the train tracks. But this time, there was more, a figure behind him, faint but present, wearing a uniform and a calm smile. Rachel's hand flew to her mouth. "Is that your dad?" Violet nodded. Rachel swallowed her tears. "And Valor?" Violet pointed to the upright dog. "Guarding." Rachel looked at the sketch, at her daughter's solemn eyes, and at the dog now asleep at her side. Something unspoken pulsed beneath the surface, an invisible thread tying past and present. In the stillness of their little cabin, as the wind rustled the pine trees and snowflakes began to drift again, Rachel whispered into the room, to no one in particular, they were never strangers. And in that moment, she began to believe that perhaps none of this was coincidence at all. Signals in the storm Silver Glen, Colorado, early February, 6:15 p.m., 19 degrees Fahrenheit, sleet turning to snow, wind gusting eastward. The storm rolled in early, thick sheets of icy rain slapping against the windowpanes of the Monroe cabin as darkness bled into the sky. Rachel peered out from the kitchen window, her breath fogging the cold glass, watching as Valor paced slowly along the porch, ears flicking toward distant sounds only he could decipher. Inside, the fire crackled, and the house pulsed with the scent of rosemary bread and melting wax from a nearby candle. It was the kind of night meant for staying in, but something in the air felt restless. Earlier that afternoon, Violet had returned from school clutching her sketchpad tighter than usual. Her cheeks were red from the cold, and her green eyes distant, as though still caught in a dream she hadn't yet escaped. Caleb, now spending part of his afternoons learning the rhythm of sourdough folding and proofing beside Rachel, watched her from the kitchen, silent but thoughtful. Something about her quiet seemed heavier tonight. Rachel had noticed it, too. The kind of hush that didn't come from contentment, but from a storm inside. As Caleb kneaded dough with slow, confident presses of his palms, Rachel sliced root vegetables for soup and tried not to read too much into Violet's long glances out the window. The girl had spoken more over the past week than in the entire year prior, and her drawings had grown increasingly vivid, filled with snow-drenched tracks, darkened train signals, and Valor always present, always watching. Then came the sudden bang. A power flicker. The stove's digital clock blinked and went dark. The lights cut off with a click, and the hum of the refrigerator gave way to silence. "Generator?" Caleb asked calmly. Rachel nodded. "Give me a flashlight." "It's in the cabinet." But before he could move, Valor stiffened. He stood at the door, alert, tail still, gaze locked toward the direction of town. Then, without warning, he let out a low huff and scratched at the door. Not frantic, intentional. Rachel opened it a few inches. Wind rushed in, flinging sleet at her face. "Valor, not now." But the dog was already out, bolting into the dark. "Mom!" Violet screamed. It was the first time she'd shouted in months. Rachel spun. "Stay here. Both of you." She grabbed her coat and flashlight and followed the dog out into the storm. Valor moved like a shadow against snow-crusted roads, occasionally stopping, ears perked, nose twitching toward the wind. He led Rachel 3 blocks east toward the tracks, now covered in slush and half-frozen puddles. Then he stopped. Rachel halted beside him, panting. "What is it?" A faint voice, so faint it might have been the wind, cried for help. Across the rails, behind a stalled maintenance van, a hunched figure was sprawled beneath the open passenger side door. Rachel dashed forward. It was Marvin Ellis, the elderly electrician who managed the town's backup systems. His legs were twisted awkwardly, his face pale. "Slipped," he rasped. "Hit my head. Couldn't move." Rachel immediately checked his pulse and warmth. "You're going to be okay. Just hold still. Valor found you." She used her phone to call emergency services, wrapping Marvin's shoulders with her scarf. Valor stood guard silently, his body shielding them from the biting wind. Minutes later, help arrived, led by Officer Jonah Hayes, who leapt from his cruiser with a flashlight and medical kit. "Monroe?" he said, stunned. "What the hell are you doing out here?" "Saving Marvin," she replied breathlessly, brushing sleep from her lashes. "Or rather, he did." She pointed to Valor. Jonah knelt beside Marvin. "We might have lost him tonight if not for." He looked up at the dog and nodded. "Good boy." Back at the cabin, Violet sat near the fire wrapped in a blanket, clutching her sketchpad. When Rachel returned, soaked and freezing, Violet rose to meet her and silently handed over a drawing, Valor standing in the snow beside a shadowed figure on the ground, his posture proud, storm swirling around them. At the edge of the paper were 4 small words in block letters. "He found him again." Rachel knelt and wrapped Violet in her arms, voice thick. "Yes, baby." He did. Across the room, Caleb turned the generator back on, lights flickering to life. The house glowed with fragile warmth. That night, as the wind howled outside and Valor lay curled beside Violet's bed like a silent sentinel, Rachel stood at the bedroom door watching them. Maybe this dog had been meant to find them, not just once, but again and again, whenever someone was lost in the dark. And as she turned off the light, she realized Violet had left one more drawing beside her pillow, Valor on his hind legs, not searching this time, but watching over them. Not guarding a stranger. Guarding home. Tracks and Truths. Silver Glen, Colorado, 1 week later, 3:30 p.m., 28 degrees Fahrenheit, clear skies, snow melting along the sidewalks. The storm had passed, leaving the town wrapped in a quilt of sparkling snow. Beneath the sun's return, Silver Glen resembled a snow globe slowly thawing. Sidewalks glistened with runnels of meltwater, and the rooftops wore softened crowns of white. Rachel stood on a ladder outside the Monroe family bakery, hammering a small hand-painted sign that read, "Winter Warmth Specials, Muffins and Memories." Inside, the bell above the door jingled as Violet and Caleb walked in together after school. Caleb wore his ever-growing parka open, his jeans streaked with salt stains and his breath still fogging with each exhale. Violet clutched her drawing pad like always, and Valor padded behind them, his ears alert, tail calmly swishing, eyes bright with the familiar scent of home. Today had marked 1 week since Valor saved Marvin Ellis. Since then, the town buzzed with whispered gratitude and quiet awe. Valor had become a local legend, not that he seemed to notice. He still watched Violet more than anything else, responding to her unspoken signals with precision that unnerved even Officer Jonah Hayes. Rachel climbed down from the ladder, brushing snow from her gloves. "You two up for cocoa before homework?" "Only if there's marshmallows," Caleb replied. Violet gave a small thumbs up. She had been speaking more, a few words at a time, mostly to Caleb and Rachel. But her drawing said more than her voice ever did. And today, she had something new tucked beneath her arm. While Rachel poured cocoa inside, Caleb disappeared into the back room, saying he'd look through more of Daniel's old storage boxes. The afternoon light streamed through the bakery windows, glinting off pastry cases and highlighting the flurries of flour still floating midair. In the quiet, Violet climbed onto a stool and opened her sketchpad. Rachel leaned in. "New one." The drawing showed the tracks again, but this time, Valor wasn't alone. He was standing beside a girl who looked unmistakably like Violet. And between them, faintly penciled, was the outline of an old wooden signpost labeled, "Wyatt." Rachel blinked. "Is that?" Violet nodded. Meanwhile, in the back, Caleb rummaged through a bin labeled, "Garage, 1997. He moved aside tools, paint cans, and a plastic crate of VHS tapes. At the bottom was a faded shoebox, wrapped in an elastic band nearly dried to powder. Inside were photos, black and white snapshots from Daniel's high school days. In one, 2 boys stood grinning in front of a makeshift police cruiser float in the town parade, Daniel and a younger Wyatt Keene, arms slung over his shoulder, both wearing cardboard badges. Beneath that was a stack of letters, some addressed to Daniel, others from Wyatt. But one envelope caught Caleb's eye, yellowed, addressed simply to Michael. Curious, he opened it. The letter inside was older than the rest, written in a different hand, and signed, "To my dearest Violet, in case I never return." He froze. Rachel entered the back room, noticing his stillness. "Caleb." He handed her the letter. "You might want to read this." Rachel took it, heart pounding. The letter was written by Wyatt to Daniel's daughter, Violet, years ago, long before she could have read it. It was full of things unsaid, promises, memories, and unspoken love for Daniel's family. It told the story of Valor, bred from a retired K-9 named Ranger, trained for protection, and originally assigned to Wyatt, who had meant for the dog to watch over Violet should anything happen. Tears welled in Rachel's eyes. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't just a stray dog. Outside, Violet stood silently with Valor at her side, the sun casting their long shadows across the snow-dappled street. Rachel stepped out, letter still in hand. "Violet," she called gently. The girl turned, eyes steady. Rachel knelt beside her. "He was meant for you. Wyatt trained him. For you. And your dad knew. I think they both wanted you to be safe." Violet reached out, fingers resting softly on Valor's back. And for the first time, Rachel heard her daughter whisper clearly, "I know." That night, Violet added a new drawing to the wall by her bed, a young officer with kind eyes, a firefighter in a jacket too large, and a dog, always the dog, standing watch beside a little girl holding a sketchpad. 3 protectors. 1 home. Signals in the storm's Silver Glen, Colorado, early February, 6:15 p.m., 19 degrees Fahrenheit, sleet turning to snow, wind gusting eastward. The storm rolled in early, thick sheets of icy rain slapping against the windowpanes of the Monroe cabin as darkness bled into the sky. Rachel peered out from the kitchen window, her breath fogging the cold glass, watching as Valor paced slowly along the porch, ears flicking toward distant sounds only he could decipher. Inside, the fire crackled, and the house pulsed with the scent of rosemary bread and melting wax from a nearby candle. It was the kind of night meant for staying in, but something in the air felt restless. Earlier that afternoon, Violet had returned from school clutching her sketchpad tighter than usual. Her cheeks were red from the cold, and her green eyes distant, as though still caught in a dream she hadn't yet escaped. Caleb, now spending part of his afternoons learning the rhythm of sourdough folding and proofing beside Rachel, watched her from the kitchen, silent but thoughtful. Something about her quiet seemed heavier tonight. Rachel had noticed it, too. The kind of hush that didn't come from contentment, but from a storm inside. As Caleb kneaded dough with slow, confident presses of his palms, Rachel sliced root vegetables for soup and tried not to read too much into Violet's long glances out the window. The girl had spoken more over the past week than in the entire year prior, and her drawings had grown increasingly vivid, filled with snow-drenched tracks, darkened train signals, and Valor always present, always watching. Then came the sudden bang. A power flicker. The stove's digital clock blinked and went dark. The lights cut off with a click, and the hum of the refrigerator gave way to silence. "Generator?" Caleb asked calmly. Rachel nodded. "Give me a flashlight. It's in the cabinet." But before he could move, Valor stiffened. He stood at the door, alert, tail still, gaze locked toward the direction of town. Then, without warning, he let out a low huff and scratched at the door. Not frantic, intentional. Rachel opened it a few inches. Wind rushed in, flinging sleet at her face. "Valor, not now." But the dog was already out, bolting into the dark. "Mom!" Violet screamed. It was the first time she'd shouted in months. Rachel spun. "Stay here. Both of you." She grabbed her coat and flashlight and followed the dog out into the storm. Valor moved like a shadow against snow-crusted roads, occasionally stopping, ears perked, nose twitching toward the wind. He led Rachel 3 blocks east toward the tracks, now covered in slush and half-frozen puddles. Then he stopped. Rachel halted beside him, panting. "What is it?" A faint voice, so faint it might have been the wind, cried for help. Across the rails, behind a stalled maintenance van, a hunched figure was sprawled beneath the open passenger side door. Rachel dashed forward. It was Marvin Ellis, the elderly electrician who managed the town's backup systems. His legs were twisted awkwardly, his face pale. "Slipped," he rasped. "Hit my head. Couldn't move." Rachel immediately checked his pulse and warmth. "You're going to be okay. Just hold still. Valor found you." She used her phone to call emergency services, wrapping Marvin's shoulders with her scarf. Valor stood guard silently, his body shielding them from the biting wind. Minutes later, help arrived, led by Officer Jonah Hayes, who leapt from his cruiser with a flashlight and medical kit. "Monroe?" he said, stunned. "What the hell are you doing out here?" "Saving Marvin," she replied breathlessly, brushing sleep from her lashes. "Or rather, he did." She pointed to Valor. Jonah knelt beside Marvin. "We might have lost him tonight if not for." He looked up at the dog and nodded. "Good boy." Back at the cabin, Violet sat near the fire wrapped in a blanket, clutching her sketchpad. When Rachel returned, soaked and freezing, Violet rose to meet her and silently handed over a drawing, Valor standing in the snow beside a shadowed figure on the ground, his posture proud, storm swirling around them. At the edge of the paper were 4 small words in block letters. "He found him again." Rachel knelt and wrapped Violet in her arms, voice thick. "Yes, baby. He did." Across the room, Caleb turned the generator back on, lights flickering to life. The house glowed with fragile warmth. That night, as the wind howled outside and Valor lay curled beside Violet's bed like a silent sentinel, Rachel stood at the bedroom door watching them. Maybe this dog had been meant to find them, not just once, but again and again, whenever someone was lost in the dark. And as she turned off the light, she realized Violet had left one more drawing beside her pillow, Valor on his hind legs, not searching this time, but watching over them. Not guarding a stranger. Guarding home. Where the tracks end: Silver Glen, Colorado, mid-March, 4:45 p.m., 41 degrees Fahrenheit, sunset streaking the sky in amber and gold. The final snow of the season melted into memory as crocuses pushed through the softening soil. The wind carried the smell of pine and distant chimney smoke. It was the kind of day where you didn't need to say goodbye to winter, you simply walked forward and let spring take your hand. Rachel stood outside the bakery, wiping down a picnic table as the last customer of the day walked off with a warm paper bag. Inside, Caleb arranged the remaining pastries while flipping through his new K9 training guide, his eyes shining with purpose. The bell above the door chimed once more, not from a customer, but from Jonah Hayes, holding 2 steaming coffees and a note tucked in his coat pocket. Rachel raised an eyebrow. "You're early." He handed her a cup. "You're surprised?" "No," she said, smiling. "Just pleased." They stood for a moment, watching the sunset turn the snowy rooftops golden. In the distance, the faint sound of laughter echoed, Violet's laughter. Out near the railroad crossing, Violet stood with Valor. She wore a denim jacket with a patch of a sunflower on the back and held her sketchpad pressed against her side. The tracks gleamed like twin threads of light, and the signal box, once broken, now mended, stood silent beside them. This had been her choice. After weeks of walking here, of listening, of remembering, Violet had finally chosen to let go of the fear. She looked at the tracks no longer as a place where someone was lost, but where something had been found. She sat down on the edge of the gravel and opened her pad. The drawing she began was slower this time, more careful. A final page, perhaps. She sketched Valor first, his strong stance, his ears perked, his eyes wise and unwavering. Then she drew a pair of boots beside him, Wyatt's, and behind them, her own footprints in the snow, fading as they walked together down the track. Rachel and Jonah arrived just as the last line was drawn. Violet looked up, her eyes bright and steady. "Done?" Jonah asked gently. Violet nodded. "Almost." She flipped to the inside cover and wrote 3 words in careful print. "We are found." Rachel knelt beside her daughter, wrapping an arm around her. Jonah took a seat on the opposite side, and Valor, as always, lay between them, watchful, calm. The sky deepened into lavender. A freight train in the distance hummed across the hills but did not come this way. It didn't need to. Back home that evening, Violet placed her finished sketchbook on a shelf between 2 of Daniel's books. Above it, Rachel framed one last drawing, a family at the edge of the tracks, a mother, a boy, a girl, and a dog beneath a sky that promised something more. And beside it, a small brass plaque. For those who wait. For those who watch. For those who come home. Valor curled beneath the window, one ear flicking toward the wind. The tracks outside no longer called. Because the story had reached its station. And what remained was not silence, but peace. Healing isn't always about forgetting the pain, it's about choosing to move forward with the memory, not despite it. In the quiet bond between a child and a faithful dog, we're reminded that sometimes home is not where you start, but where someone waits to bring you back.